Welcome back to the class video for Module 11, in which we're looking at James Madison's Notes on the Debates in the Federal Convention. In the first part of class, we define these three concepts, each of which is a possible answer to the question, what do representatives represent? The first answer, and the principle embodied in the Articles of Confederation, is that the states are the contracting agents to create a central or federal government. And the debate within the convention is either that principle or one of two alternatives, each of which are proposed as more equitable basis for representation. Either that the people or individual citizens are the things being represented by their representatives, or property, wealth, taxes, quotas of contributions are the things being represented. Having defined those basic categories, then in the second part of class, we looked at the primary debate, either states or some more equitable basis. And we tried to understand why that was such a difficult conceptual problem for the delegates to the convention to resolve, because the compromise presented by a bicameral legislative structure was not sufficient for either side. The concession to the other side entailed a negation of their own principles of sovereignty. Having seen that primary debate work its way out, we're going to now turn in the final portion of class to consider the alternatives, some more equitable or proportional representation, either the people or property. And what we will find as we turn now to the text is that exactly that dilemma ignites, if you will, the central problem of the new republic. What is the role of slaves? And are the existence of slaves consistent with creating a republic dedicated to freedom and equality? Now, as we'll see, that's a complicated question. The question posed to the delegates is not, is slavery a good thing? Is slavery a justifiable thing? Can men have legitimate property rights in other men? They are not answering the abstract philosophical or moral question about slavery. They are addressing the question of representation and whether slaves should be included within the principle of representation. Because that is the predicate question, or if you will, the premise that frames the debate, your position on that predicate question then determines your answer to the question on the nature of slaves. That is to say, if you are from a non-slave holding state and you believe that the basis of representation is property, then you're going to want to argue that slaves are people, right? Because that will deny the slaveholding states representation based on that. If conversely, you're from a non-slaveholding state, but you think representation is based on personhood, then you're likely to think that slaves are property, because again, you're going to want to advantage your own state in comparison to those states that have slaves. So your point of view or your perspective on the predicate question goes a long way towards determining which side of the case you're going to argue on the specific question of the nature of slavery. Because of this kind of Rubik's Cube shape of the debate, then, we can find delegates from both slaveholding and non-slaveholding states taking both positions on the kind of primary question or surface level question, is a slave a person or is a slave a piece of property? The 3/5 formula that they ultimately kind of stumble their way back into is not some specific formula for resolving that question. In other words, it is not an answer, slaves are roughly 60% people, 40% property. It is instead a kind of illogical compromise that simply garners a majority. That is to say, the extremists on both sides are excluded, but there's a large enough body of delegates in the middle who are simply willing to go along with 3/5 for no other reason than it can derive a majority of votes in the delegation. And the 3/5 formula, rather than some specific formulation for what percentage person or property a slave is, merely represents a compromise number that will derive a majority in the convention. So let's turn now to the text and see why slavery is such a profoundly corrosive, toxic concept within this debate of trying to determine the foundation of democratic representation. Let's turn now to the text. We pick up the debates on July 9th with the return of a committee report by Governor Morris, a committee that was appointed to draft a clause describing the apportionment of representation in the House of Representatives. You will recall that the delegates had been playing with this math, this hypothetical math about the number of votes each state would get on a proportional basis, and they were basing that math roughly on the apportionment of taxes under the Continental Congress. That is to say, Virginia's been paying about 16 times more than Georgia in the annual contributions that have been required of it. Therefore, if we start from Georgia getting 1 delegate, Virginia then would get 16 delegates. And the important thing was to determine what weight would the largest states play. That is to say, how many states would it take to make up a majority? How few states could make up a majority? William Patterson seemed to think that the 3 largest states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, would constitute a majority. Luther Martin gave us the math that those 3 states would have 42 out of 90 votes on that kind of proportional scale, so very near a majority. But this is all essentially guesswork, again, based on the year-to-year percentages that the Continental Congress had assigned to each state, and those percentages varied in different years of the contributions. Once the basic compromise had been settled upon or sort of backed into that the Senate would represent states as contracting agents and the House of Representatives would be based proportionately, then the convention was able to turn to, well, what would that proportionality look like? And after some debate and kind of contentious arguments, they decided to appoint a committee chaired by Governor Morris to go and draft some language that then they could debate. And what we're seeing here on July 9th is that committee coming back and saying, we talked about it, and here's the numbers that we would come up with. But notice the mandate they were given, and it's very close to the language in the final Constitution. The committee was charged with not estimating based on the quotas of contribution in the Continental Congress. Rather, as the phrase at the top of the left-hand column says, if there were to be as 1 to every 40,000 inhabitants as follows. Now, the final text of the Constitution is going to say 1 for every 30,000 inhabitants, so they compromise to that degree, but it's the same principle. Go out and get an estimate of the population of each state. If each state were to get 1 representative for every 40,000 inhabitants, how many representatives would they have? And we have the committee's answer here in the body of the succeeding paragraph. New Hampshire would have 2, Massachusetts 7, Rhode Island 1, Connecticut 4, New York 5, etc., etc. Now we see that this math is pretty close to the math that the delegates had been playing with preceding. If you count up out of 56 votes, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania would have 24, a slightly smaller near majority. But if, again, you add in the 4th biggest state, New York, that would take them to 29. So essentially both conditions, they were wrong to say that the 3 largest states would have a majority. Would actually be the 4 largest states under this math. Now we have to appreciate how crude are the social statistics of the late 18th century, right? They really don't have solid census numbers. They certainly don't have anything like comprehensive statistics on what people own. They do have local taxation tax lists. Every state does it differently. You have to remember all of these are handwritten documents. This is 18th century technology. So they're estimating in the crudest possible way about either the actual population of any given region or state, and certainly the valuation of the property that's owned by the people in any given region or state. So when Luther Martin, in the highlighted passage at the bottom of the left-hand column on page 9, when Luther Martin asks, he wished to know whether the committee were guided in the ratio by the wealth or number of inhabitants of the states, or by both. Noting its variations from the former apportionments by Congress, Governor Morris replies, "The report is little more than a guess." And that's an honest answer. When the delegates talk about one state being richer than another, what they really mean is the kind of density of commerce, how much buying and selling and trade each state is doing. And Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, of course, are home to the largest ports in North America. They do tons of commerce for the neighboring colonies. The delegates in the late 18th century, and Americans generally in the 18th century, have very crude ways of measuring either population or property. But that's not really Luther Martin's point, of course. What he's pointing out is the bias of the question or the mandate given to the committee. The mandate specifically requires them to measure inhabitants. So when he asks, did you go by wealth or number of inhabitants, that's a kind of a disingenuous question meant to point out the fact that they did go by inhabitants. And inhabitants, of course, is a critical conceptual term because it transcends or encompasses all the different possible divisions of civic identity. That is to say, inhabitants include some group larger than, say, citizens. It includes some group larger than, say, voters. It certainly includes a group larger than property owners. It implies certainly that it would include those household categories that John Locke said were excluded from political society, but nevertheless had a role within some larger group, which he called the household, or Rousseau called the general will or culture. That there are these tiers of civic agency or empowerment for participation. Inhabitants is the broadest possible category. It's also the category that corresponds most closely with Tom Paine's description of our natural rights for each individual to participate in the system by which they're ruled. And it's this particular conceptual term, inhabitants, which ignites the debate about whether slaves should be considered within that category. And we see William Patterson from New Jersey on the right-hand column of page 9 registering his complaint. He says that he could regard the Negro slaves in no light but as property. They are no free agents, have no personal liberty, no faculty of acquiring property, but on the contrary are themselves property, and like other property entirely at the will of the master. What is the true principle of representation? It is an expedient by which an assembly of certain individuals, chosen by the people, is substituted in place of the inconvenient meeting of the people themselves. If such a meeting of the people was actually to take place, would the slaves vote? They would not. Why then should they be represented? He was also against such an indirect encouragement of the slave trade. This description should call immediately to our minds Thomas Paine's description of what is the basis of representation. At some point, the community becomes too large and it becomes inconvenient for them to assemble themselves, and they merely hand their representative a proxy vote to carry out their right on their behalf. Now, as Patterson rightly points out, the critical question is, in such a simple community where every person had the right to vote, who would actually have the right to vote? He points out, he seems obvious, slaves would not. But we could ask about the other categories of the household. That is to say, most critically, would women have the right to vote? Think of how ambiguous John Locke's description of women's autonomy is in the Second Treatise. That ambivalent category, they're almost as equal as men, but almost not quite, and therefore the husbands have to rule. What would Patterson say about whether in this simple natural community, whether women would have the right to cast a vote? And we can look at the categories that he presents. They're no free agents, no personal liberty, no faculty of acquiring property, but on the contrary are themselves property. Well, Patterson would likely to answer yes to some of those, but no to others for women. And so gender is another great example of the indeterminacy of these tiers of civic empowerment, and why, in the context of the discussion of representation, which is political sovereignty empowered to the central institution, the categories of the household, the great contradiction that we discussed when we were looking at Locke's and Rousseau's definitions of slavery, become a central conceptual paradox for the American framers. And the complexity, the kind of self-dissolving or self-corrosive nature of slavery as a conceptual category throughout the debate is evident in the next two replies to Patterson's complaint. You will recall that William Patterson, in the first half of the reading, was the great advocate for the position that the basis of representation should be neither personhood nor property, at least at the federal level, that the proper basis of representation was to recognize the states as the contracting parties to the federal Constitution. Isn't he now contradicting himself in taking the position that it is every person who should be, or every person empowered to vote naturally, should be the thing that is represented by federal representation? And that's exactly the point that James Madison rises to make. You have to appreciate the kind of ironic or taunting or mocking nature of Madison's speech here at the bottom of the right-hand column of 9. Mr. Madison reminded Mr. Patterson that his doctrine of representation, which was in its principle the genuine one, must forever silence the pretensions of the small states to an equality of votes with the large ones. They ought to vote in the same proportion in which their citizens would if the people of all the states were collectively met. He suggested as a proper ground of compromise that in the first branch the states should be represented according to their numbers of free inhabitants, and in the second, which had for its primary objects the guardianship of property, according to the whole number, including slaves. So Madison here is inviting Patterson, he is agreeing with Patterson, he's saying, I agree with you that personhood is the proper basis of representation, but in order for us to carry that into effect properly, you are going to have to renounce your proposal that the states each have one vote or an equal vote. Now we can see how slippery Madison's terminology in here is. Notice he first mentions they ought to vote in the same proportion in which their citizens would. Citizens is a very different word than inhabitants. It sort of implies those people who are empowered to vote within the states, which should be the basis of representation, which is very different than counting up every person. But then he returns to number of free inhabitants in the final line. And of course this division, number of free inhabitants in the popular branch, and then the number of free inhabitants plus slaves, because the second branch's object is property, reflects that New York constitutional model, which was the most typical constitutional model in the states in the post-revolutionary period, that is to dedicate their bicameral structure of their legislature, their two houses, to embrace both those principles, personhood and property. So Madison is retorting to Patterson to construct the federal model on pretty much the same principles as the state models. And that, of course, is appealing to everything that Patterson had said in the first half of the debate, thus pointing out the hypocrisy of his position now. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind the kind of two-stage structure of the debate. The first question is either persevere with the Articles of Confederation model or adopt some equitable proportion, and what that equitable proportion could be either personhood or property, for us to understand that the debate, this is not a serious proposal by Madison. We're not going to renege on that fundamental agreement, that prior agreement, that the bicameral structure will reflect on the one hand states' rights or states as the contracting agents, and the other some combination of personhood and property. That would require the entire convention to back up the primary, the compromise that had allowed this portion of the debate to go forward. So a more significant, perhaps, proposal or a counterpoint is offered by Rufus King. And we have to understand that Rufus King is a northerner. He's from Massachusetts. On the top of the left-hand column of 10, Madison reports that Mr. King had always expected that as the southern states are the richest, they would not league themselves with the northern unless some respect were paid to their superior wealth. If the latter expected those preferential distinctions in commerce and other advantages which they will derive from the connection, they must not expect to receive them without allowing some advantages in return. 11 out of 13 of the states had agreed to consider slaves in the apportionment of taxation, and taxation and representation ought to go together. So King is a moderate, he's a compromiser, he's from a northern state, and he's trying to offer some concessions to the southern states for the sake of the Union. He's not going to say that it's exactly fair. He says they are going to want some advantages, but it's because they are richer. Notice a couple of things about this. The premise in the first half of the debate was that the large states were the richest states. Well, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts are 2/3 of the large states. That is, wealth or riches didn't indicate slave or non-slave in the first half of the debate. King here assumes that the southern states are the richest. Why? Because they own the slaves, which makes it as a form of wealth. But when you have slaves, you are primarily producing cash crops. That is, you're wealthy from your trade and commerce. But the distinction here is not large versus small, it's northern versus southern. Finally, we need to observe that William Patterson is also from a non-slave state, New Jersey. And so here we have two northerners, that is, two delegates from non-slave states, disagreeing on the nature of slavery and representation. But what's the root of that disagreement? It's not primarily whether slavery is good or evil. It's their assumptions about what is the foundation of representation. William Patterson is arguing that personhood is the basis of representation, and therefore slavery must be alien from, it must be excluded from the formula for representation. Rufus King, a fellow northerner, if you will, from a non-slaveholding state, has the opposite premise of what is the foundation of representation. He thinks that taxation and representation go together. Because of that difference in underlying principle, he can come to an opposite conclusion than his fellow free state delegate. So you're deriving from either a free state or a slave state does not predetermine your view on the question, what is the connection, or what role should slavery play in the formula for federal representation. And we can see a comparable contradiction or inversion among two Southern delegates if we look at the right-hand column of page 10. Skip over Nathaniel Gorham. We'll come back to that. But jump down to Pierce Butler here in the second highlighted passage from South Carolina. Mr. Butler insisted that the labor of a slave in South Carolina was as productive and valuable as that of a free man in Massachusetts. That as wealth was the great means of defense and utility to the nation, they were equally valuable to it with freemen, and that consequently an equal representation ought to be allowed for them in a government which was instituted principally for the protection of property and was itself to be supported by property. So here we have a Southern delegate from South Carolina demanding full representation for his slaves and his state's slaves because he believes that slaves are property. Notice the equation here of labor. It's not the ownership of the slave that's critical. It's that the state is going to tax the produce of the slave's labor in exactly the same way that the state is going to tax the labor of free people. And it's their productive capacity which renders them valid or eligible or essential to any formula for representation. Why? Because representation is fundamentally about property. But immediately following, George Mason from Virginia rises in opposition. Madison writes, Mr. Mason could not agree to the motion, notwithstanding that it was favorable to Virginia, because he thought it unjust. It was certain that the slaves were valuable, as they raised the value of land, increased the exports and imports, and of course the revenue would supply the means of feeding and supporting an army, and might in cases of emergency become themselves soldiers. As in these important respects they were useful to the community at large, they ought not to be excluded from the estimate of representation. He could not, however, regard them as equal to freemen, and could not vote for them as such. He added worthy of remark that the southern states have this peculiar species of property over and above the other species of property common to all the states. So here Mason agrees with Butler about the basis of representation, that it is property. But even conceding that the slaves contribute to property, he cannot consider the slaves as equal to freemen. Why is that? Because the root of Mason's conception of political sovereignty is personhood, and he can't equate those two. The slave can't make the transition to personhood in his mind in the same way that it can make the transition in property. So here you have two Southerners, two delegates from slave states who agree on the underlying principles of representation and yet come to opposite positions on the question of slavery. Again, it's merely to point out the kind of corrosive, the innate conceptual problem that slavery as the most extreme of all the household categories present to democratic theory. So in that context, we can begin to see the elements of the compromise that are going to emerge in the final Constitution. If we come back to page 10 and return to Nathaniel Gorham, a delegate from Massachusetts, Madison reports that Mr. Gorham, this ratio was fixed by Congress as a rule of taxation. Then it was urged by the delegates representing the states having slaves that the blacks were still more inferior to freemen. At present, when the ratio of representation is to be established, we are assured that they are equal to freemen. The arguments on the former occasion had convinced him that 3/5 was pretty near the just proportion, and he should vote according to the same opinion now. So Gorham is pointing out, if you will, the hypocrisy of the southern states. Back when we were talking about a rule of taxation, you say only count them as 3/5. Now when we're talking about representation, you want them to be equal. But at the end of the day, because he's a moderate and a compromiser, he's kind of shrugging his shoulders and saying, 3/5 is good enough for me. It's a fair approximation. It's good enough to move the debate forward, to get us beyond this log jam, this fundamental contradiction. And after Butler and Mason have their little back and forth, we see Hugh Williamson of North Carolina essentially making the same point in reverse to Gorham. He says on the left-hand column of 11, Mr. Williamson reminded Mr. Gorham that if the southern states contended for the inferiority of blacks to whites when taxation was in view, the eastern states on the same occasion contended for their equality. He did not, however, either then or now concur in either extreme, but approved of the ratio of 3/5. So here is a Southern delegate pointing back to the Massachusetts delegate saying, you're pointing out our hypocrisy. I'm happy to acknowledge your hypocrisy, but I too am a moderate and a compromiser. I'll go along with 3/5 if it'll move the debate forward. And that sense that 3/5 doesn't really make any particular sense. It's certainly not any precise algebraic formula for determining the worth of a slave, but is merely a compromise number that had been recognized by the Continental Congress previously. It seems to be almost halfway between the two positions here. What the heck, I'll vote for it just if we can move on to debating the next plank of the Constitution. That kind of tone of the debate is best encapsulated in the following page, on page 12, on the right-hand column, James Wilson of Pennsylvania here in the highlighted highlighted passage. Mr. Wilson did not well see on what principle the admission of blacks in the proportion of 3/5 could be explained. Are they admitted as citizens? Then why are they not admitted on an equality with white citizens? Are they admitted as property? Then why is not other property admitted into the computations? These were difficulties, however, which he thought must be overruled by the necessity of compromise. This summary by Wilson really best encapsulates why the final constitutional text ends up with that 3/5 terms. It literally makes no sense, as Wilson acknowledges here, but it's a number that can rally a majority of delegates within the convention who are acutely sensitive to the insolubility of the slavery question. It is evident to the delegates that this is the issue that will blow up the convention. And if we don't go along with 3/5, even though it doesn't make any sense, we have no hope of coming to a final text of the document. And we can see that tone of compromise, kind of surrender, if you will, if not wholehearted agreement, start to take hold in the convention in the debates that followed. On the left-hand column of page 13, at the end of that day's debate, Governor Morris was compelled to declare himself reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the southern states or to human nature, and he must therefore do it to the former. But his primary focus now becomes the slave trade, which indeed will lead to a separate discussion around Article 1, Section 9, and the powers of Congress, and a clause that prohibits Congress from prohibiting the slave trade for 20 years, which implies a power to do so thereafter. And so the debate is going to get sidetracked here, or you see John Davey on the right-hand column of 13 from South Carolina, all up in arms. He said it was high time to speak out now. He saw that it was meant by some gentlemen to deprive the southern states of any share of representation for their blacks. He was sure that North Carolina would never confederate on any terms that did not rate them at least 3/5. If the eastern states meant, therefore, to exclude them altogether, the business was at an end. Well, here's a bold declaration to walk out of the convention and to cancel the whole thing, at the same time as it says, but if you give us 3/5, everything will be fine. And so you can see the kind of gravity kind of generating around this 3/5 number, even though it doesn't make any logical sense. Or you can see in Dr. Johnson's reply, Hugh Johnson's reply, who you recall earlier was strongly advocating for the principle that slaves are property and property is the basis of representation. Now he comes back with Dr. Johnson thought that wealth and population were the true equitable rule of representation, but he conceived that these two principles resolve themselves into one, population being the best measure of wealth. He concluded, therefore, that the number of people ought to be established as the rule, and that all descriptions, including blacks equally with whites, ought to fall within the computation. So here's another Southerner who still wants equal representation for blacks and whites, but he's saying, well, I guess wealth and population, we could combine them together. One's as good as the other. Again, you see that the forces of moderation start to come to the fore in the convention once the delegates kind of swallow the stupid number of 3/5. There's one more trick that we have to observe that results in the final language of the constitutional clause. You will recall that both representation and direct taxes shall be apportioned according to the census number, based on all free persons and 3/5 of all others. So that trick of moving the principle of wealth into the subject of the sentence, if you will, representation and direct taxes, and that phrase direct taxes being the operative principle or concept reflecting wealth or property, comes about here in the July 12th discussion. We see, if we come back to the left-hand column of 13 and the introduction of the July 12th debates, Mr. Governor Morris moved to add to the clause empowering the legislature to vary the representation according to the principle of wealth and inhabitants, a, quote, proviso that taxation shall be in proportion to representation. Now, the logic of that change, that inversion, if you will, is explained by James Wilson on the following page. On the left-hand column of 14 in the highlighted passage, Wilson responds to the proposal by saying, Wilson observed that less umbrage would perhaps be taken against an admission of the slaves into the rule of representation if it should be so expressed as to make them indirectly only an ingredient of the rule by saying that they should enter into the rule of taxation. And as representation was to be according to taxation, the end would be equally attained. So simply by changing the grammatical structure of the sentence, rather than it being written, representation is based on population and taxation determined by the following method, instead of phrasing it that way, if we phrase it, representation and taxes shall be based on the census number, which grammatically means exactly the same thing, Wilson admits perhaps less umbrage would be taken. The end result is that all three concepts, representation, personhood, and property, are all combined into that one clause representing one house out of two within one branch of the federal structure. We see that the delegates got here not by any great declaration of truth and principles, but by merely backing into a formula that allows them to escape the insoluble conflict that the discussion of slavery and representation brings about. And this is just one example of one theme within the convention debates. We've only looked at the debates around two clauses. Virtually every clause in the Constitution has some comparable conceptual conflict, and it's that primarily that I've asked you to enter into in your textual genealogy to reconstruct a comparable debate and to understand the conceptual problems in working out the final text of the Constitution. All right, we're going to leave the Constitution itself now, and we're going to turn in the final two modules of the course to looking at the debate over the ratification of the Constitution.